This is episode number 425, being recorded on the 26th of May, 2022, with special guests, Mark Eisenberg, and of course we have Evan and Kendall as well joining us today to do a quick roundup on the Build 2022 news updates relative to Azure. So, normally we'd start the show by doing news updates, but the whole show is about news updates this time. So that's all we're going to do is news updates.
It's the joy of Build Week, right? We're just like awash in news,
exactly.
Right?
And we were trying to do a quick summary before we met up on the show here, and it just seems like there's so much to talk about. But I think each one of us is going to cover some of our respective areas of passion, and we can take it from there. I'd like to, also mention Mark has been on the show before a few times. He's talked about Service Fabric. What used to be one of his favorite services before, and then microservices. So we're happy to have him back so you can share his thoughts about all the build announcements. So Mark, I'd like to give you the floor first to maybe you could start us off with some of your favorite build announcements from the last couple of days.
So it's interesting because you talked about the Service Fabric, and to remind people, I said, I think on the first one we did, that Service Fabric to me was the coolest thing we had ever done and might be the coolest thing that anybody had ever done. But it really did require that you reshape your architecture thinking and how you're going to build problems. I had customers that had adopted it and turned off all the auto stuff. So they just weren't getting any benefit. I begged the program manager, it's like, we need to like hold people's hands and we need to really kind of explain what this magic is. We all knew, but the customer base coming from a traditional perspective didn't get it. So ACA particularly, or excuse me, Azure Container Apps, with the addition of Dapper and the other two, the Kita and Envoy components, is the first time I felt like we've really got a story that we can tell around, in that same microservice kind of platform, or as the DevOps handbook says, loosely coupled platforms. It doesn't have to be microservices, but it's a good way to do it. And what I'm hoping, I think the sessions yesterday were a good start, particularly the one that the Dev Tools group did, really showing how the developer experience is enhanced with deploying distributed applications into our into our services.
It's interesting, Mark, as I listen to you talk about that, I think about sort of what Microsoft, what we're good at, right, is we build a platform that other people can build stuff on top of. Sometimes we get out ahead of that, cloud services, right? If anybody remembers those, right? It was sort of ahead of its time. It's still, in a lot of ways, it's still a fantastic product, but it required so many changes, right, that it just didn't ever get the traction. Yeah, exactly.
Right.
And but I think what's interesting, and we'll talk about some of this later when we talk about some of the Java stuff. Like in the old days, we would have just kept at this and trying to convince our customers and the industry to follow something. Now, if there's a better thing that comes along, Azure Container Apps, AKS, like we sort of pivot, right, and then help build best, good scenarios for those capabilities within our world, which is it's a much better place at the end of the day, I think, for everybody.
Yeah, it is. Although I don't know if you remember my history, I was one of the first 4 Azure salespeople in 2009. So I know all about, I do know that the evangelism
that might have been where
group,
we first met, actually, way back. Yeah.
So the evangelism team had Azure PaaS that Ray Ozzie and company had built as a better mousetrap, but they didn't understand it and they didn't know how to explain it to our customers. And our customers went into we want IaaS, we want a VM vending machine, right? And so I'm still a little twitchy that I don't think we were that far ahead of ourselves. We didn't take the time to really explain what cloud native was about. We didn't even have that term at the time. Yep. But the benefits of it. But I will tell you that a key part of my talk track with clients now is, if you want to, because they'll say, we need to be better at X. And I'm like, if you want to be better at X, you have to change how you're doing things. Yeah. Because by definition, you cannot get any better if you keep doing the same thing. And I think that's one of the things with our messaging where we get tripped up, because our big giant customers say we have to do it this way. And I'm all about, but
Yeah.
And
No,
so
agreed.
ACA to me is another into the breach and, have the opportunity. And the developer story is part of it. But I think in the enterprise world where ops has so much say in how these things are, we need a really good, better together story for dev and ops with ACA and then Dapper and the like with it.
Agreed.
Yeah,
No, totally agreed.
I'm going to jump in here. So I think what Mark is saying is I did an incredible job as a PM. Thank you so much, Mark. I will take that as a personal compliment to myself.
It's
yeah,
it's connect time, right? So perfect statement, right?
Oh my gosh, yes, so great. But no, I obviously am super happy to be on the episode because I haven't been around much and it's been a real effort. But I just want to echo, the sentiments that you mentioned, Mark. Like, I am super passionate about the making sure that the platform is really positioned the way that we intended for it to be positioned, and that's as not a managed version of AKS, right? Because even out of build, right, we see these great capabilities coming out of AKS and the AKS team, and they're going to continue to optimize the AKS specific experience, right? The new introduction of draft 2 to make development easier, and the integration with Kata, which is something similar to what we have on container apps. And even something that wasn't mentioned, but I'm familiar with is Dapper actually has an extension now that can be run on AKS. So there's going to be a lot of these capabilities that come to AKS to make it easier to operate and manage. But that's really not the space that container apps was created for. It was created to really provide that app service experience for people who want to run containers and they want to run microservices and they want to host them in containers, right? And so how do we bring some of that management capability and abstract away that infrastructure? And I think we have to continue to lean into that. And I agree with you. We have to figure out what the balance looks like for making it easier for developers to use, but also not forgetting the fact that there's still going to be really stringent operations requirements and governance and security protocol that we have to kind of fit in order for enterprises to adopt. But we can't be so rigid that we don't also say, hey, I know this is how you've traditionally done things, but here's another model that we can introduce that might actually be a better way for us to go about this. And so I think there's going to be a lot of collaboration with field resources, especially those who are in roles like I was in before I joined Container Apps, people who are working with large enterprise customers who are working with containers, right? Container patching, how do we manage our containers? That, this doesn't solve that problem. And so how do we provide some of that capability or even just that guidance so that customers aren't just going to ACA, but they're really able to adopt the entire end-to-end cloud native journey, and with Container Apps just being the hosting platform at the end of that. So anything we can do to make that easier. So yeah, I'm obviously really, really excited about this, but we're just getting started. We have so many amazing features in the pipeline and so much feedback to gather. So yeah, I just wanted to call out, how excited I am about the fact that we were able to push this to the finish line, or at least to stage 1 of getting it out the door, which to me was providing the SLA for customers who are ready to adopt.
And to add on to that, I think we can't separate this from the DevOps conversation. You're right, it's a great place to do this, but where the enterprise thinking is somewhat disconnected right now is how critical continuous delivery is to the point, like you were saying about patching containers. If you actually do a healthy DevOps flow, then that's going to be built in there. And this platform will, if it doesn't do it already, but I'm pretty sure it does, we just need to, again, hit that point about change.
Yeah,
if
and
you want to be faster.
We don't handle some of those things because patching, for example, is something that you want to be customer controlled. So I think it's going to be a matter of how do we provide easy diagnosability or even just alerting to make sure that we empower customers to take on which responsibilities they want to have control over, and then the things that we can manage for them as well. And who knows what that evolution will look like. But I think one of the biggest things that my biggest focus area for Container Apps is Dapper and open source experiences. But I think we're going to be doing a lot of investment in DevOps. I think you'll see that the whole team is really passionate about making sure that we strengthen the DevOps story and make it easier for customers to really securely get their workloads continuously into Container Apps. So, so yeah.
Yep, I agree with all of that. So,
Evan, Oh, sorry, Mark.
No, go
Continue your
ahead.
thought.
I was going to say I saw Evan's note, so.
Well, I was going to, yeah, I mean, let's say if Evan has something he liked about Build.
Yeah, I'll go back to some of my roots. I guess these days I've been away from networking technically, that's different roots. But there's some interesting SQL database stuff that came out. I thought the ledger capability basically, it's sort of like the what do we call it? The change data capture, but it's on steroids, right? It's built in and it's immutable. At that point, also a bunch of the JSON stuff that we've added to there, because JSON really has become the standard language, right, for communication. XML. I think I've seen some XML recently, but I can't remember the last time I saw it in new code.
It's fading away,
right? I used to actually debug XML. That's how long I've been doing this. So, and then the other thing, and again, this sort of brings me back to the, some of the integrations with .NET many years ago with Azure, with SQL Server, but like now you can call any Azure function and really any REST endpoint from within Azure SQL database natively. Right. So if you need to go, trigger something based on some data, or go, hey, I got this data, so I need to go retrieve this other piece of data and then put them in together. Right. Really simplifying that. I mean, this really goes towards that low code type world where I'm doing minimal effort to do maximal connectivity. Hey, we can even call container apps, because there's REST endpoints. But yeah, I think this stuff is great about sort of just making it easier for people to make these connections between their app and their data.
But to the point that Kendall was making earlier, we do this really cool stuff. We need to make sure that the market understands
absolutely
what our intent was. How were we innovating here? Why were we innovating? This is all great technology. That's the first part of the story. And then we'll get out here and we'll be talking about the benefits of it and how you can impact your application architectures with it.
Absolutely.
I think that's really cool, Evan. I hadn't heard about that, but I think it does. Like, I just think that theming of like us really moving toward a more event-driven cloud, all up, just having better integration between services, better connectivity, better ability to really drive action based on other things happening in the environment. Like, to me, that's a really cool underlying theme that we're seeing. So I think I'm glad that you shared that update, because I had not heard that.
Yeah, it's sort of like this next level, right? As you build the base stuff and then you start laying on this stuff that's nice to have. The other cool thing that, for people that do development sort of in a disconnected fashion, which, there's lots of cases where that happens, but is there's now a full fidelity SQL database emulator, that you can run locally for, when you're doing VS Code and Azure Data Studio, right? So you don't have to connect up to your real Azure SQL database to do this. You could, not that anybody these days is generally without network connectivity very long. There's a lot of challenges when that happens, but you don't necessarily have to be working against a database to do your development at this point, which is great. It's sort of that DevOps model. I can work locally and then I push it to the cloud when I need to.
And Cosmos has the same thing, right? And I don't know if that was an announcement in the overview. I heard her hit it.
Yeah, I think it's been around for a little while. I honestly just don't know whether or not it's full fidelity or some partial capability. But yeah, there's some at least, a pretty significant emulator, I think, for Cosmos as well.
Yeah, and then also even on the SQL side, you mentioned about the function being able to call a function, but I think the reverse is also true. Is now functions can trigger off a SQL database table update or something like that. So that's a nice built-in feature that they've had in there. I also wanted to mention
if I can, real quick comment. What we all have to kind of watch out on that is we're supposed to be helping get business logic out of the data tier. So it requires discipline, because that feature could absolutely be used to snarl us back into the business logic and the data tier. So we need to, again, it's another topic that we need to be discussing with customers.
Yeah, I mean, we should treat it as an event-driven system, right? Where, okay, this thing is now triggering another event, and then you could do something else in that Azure function, for example.
Exactly.
Yeah. And also in terms of bindings, now I was surprised they've announced a Kafka trigger as well in Azure Functions.
Nice.
Right? So that's nice. Yeah. So they've expanded. Like we used to have service bus triggers, and now you could even trigger off Kafka and SQL. So it looks like Functions is becoming much more powerful in terms of being to support this event-driven architecture that you just talked about. That's what's going to drive it. And I really like the new Nginx service that they have
I was
started
going
up.
to get to that one.
Okay. Then I'll
Yeah,
leave it
that's
for you.
another
If
one.
you're
Go, I mean, go ahead,
We all
Sujit.
had we all had that one on our list.
Is that the F5? Was that the F5 session?
Yes.
Yeah. I didn't get to that. It's
F5.
on my list, but I haven't watched it yet.
Yeah.
So they basically, it's like a load balancing kind of solution that they have now in Azure using the Nginx software, of course, hosted and managed by Microsoft on Azure. And you can do all those complicated routing rules, some like, for example, trying to set up authentication at the edge, connecting into your IDP and things like that. So that's all now out of the box. And people who would normally stand up their own Nginx and then have to struggle with it, it's not easy to configure and stand up Nginx correctly. And hopefully this will make it easier.
Yeah, this is sort of, and again, there's a theme along this direction. So we're doing this with Dynatrace, right, as well, where we're integrating these third-party apps through the marketplace into Azure, so that you're sort of managing it with the same APIs and the same UI that you're doing to manage all your other stuff. Again, that's just sort of making life easier for the end customers without making them change what they're using, right?
Yeah.
Hey, I'm an Nginx user. I can still use Nginx. I just now have an easier management experience. Kendall, go ahead.
Yeah, so I just wanted to pepper a couple out there. I don't think I have to go too deep on too many of them, but the GitHub OpenID Connect for Azure AD like workload identity is basically now generally available. I think that one's really, really big from like a GitHub Actions perspective. Just like if you've worked with GitHub Actions and like expired credentials in GitHub and connectivity to Azure, like I just feel like that's going to be a really good capability and definitely help to accelerate some of our developer platforms, because customers will have more, I don't know, just more confidence, right, and how they're connecting to Azure. And so I think that's a really good one, that one GA. So that's something that's been around, but now I feel like more adoption will definitely take place there. Another one is, and this is so funny, when I joined Microsoft, we did these sort of like new hire projects, and one of the ones that I got assigned was working with Xamarin, because at the time we had just acquired Xamarin, that kind of cross-platform development experience, so that you can write for iOS, Android, those kind of things. And so it's been a long journey since I joined, since I've almost been here for 6 years, but .NET MAUI is now out there, which I feel like is really going to enhance the, cross-platform development experience, being able to really develop these cool cross-platform applications using C#. And then I had one more that I wanted to call out, which was, let me see if I can find it here. Oh, API management. So like a lot of customers that I used to work with in GBB are big API management users, and GraphQL was like a big sort of demand from customers, right? How do we have support for GraphQL pass through? And so that's now, I believe, generally available. So that's another just kind of exciting thing. If you've been looking at API management, or if you've sort of started to adopt those kind of APIs and wanted that support, that's now something that's available for you to use. So those were just a few that I wanted to pepper in that I thought that at least stood out to me because of customer demand in the past.
I love the MAUI mention, because it really has nothing to do with this podcast, right? This is the Azure podcast, but we all find it so cool that it's all coming up. We're all bringing it up because the story looks really good.
Yeah, Mark, what else do you like from Build?
So the investment in Java really caught my attention. The fact that there's the Azure Java apps, there's the Spring apps, which I guess is the renamed Spring Cloud, and then all of the Java capability is being included in app services now. I call on a bunch of ISVs that are these massive 20-year-old Java applications, and this is going to help bring them into the cloud native world, with these good services that know how to speak Java. What's
the difference between Java apps and the Spring Cloud? Is it sort of, again, like Spring Cloud, it's a little bit more you're deploying the infrastructure underneath it, or what's sort of containers versus container apps, or what's the?
Well, I would not on the Spring stuff. I'm going to yield to my expert over here on my left. And then the way the Java apps looked to me was it was more generic. You know, that it could basically,
Oh,
if
so not just
we're
it doesn't have to be a
partnered,
Spring
right? It's
thing.
like
It can be
JBoss and
Java.
Tomcat
Gotcha.
and all that kind of
Yeah,
stuff
yeah.
is in there, whereas the Spring Cloud is very
Yeah.
specific to Spring.
Gotcha.
Yeah,
Okay.
it's
That
Yeah,
makes
and I
Spring
would
Boot
say
is a.
I would. Oh, go ahead. Go ahead,
No, I was
Sujit.
going to say Spring Boot's like a framework that
Yeah.
is optional framework that Java developers can use. Very popular, been around for 20 years at least, and it has a lot of infrastructure style bits associated with it in terms of a configuration server and whatnot. And normally you'd have to configure all of that, or even like having a directory, like a directory services, so that microservices can find each other. So that you'd normally have to stand that up. So Spring Originals, Azure Spring Cloud, and now the Spring Apps sort of hides all
That
of
makes
that
sense.
and then makes it easy to get access to those features.
Makes sense.
Sorry,
Yeah,
Kendall.
so
Go ahead.
yeah, I was just gonna say, like, I don't think we fully said it, but for those of you who weren't aware, Spring Cloud has been rebranded to Spring Apps. And my understanding is it actually will support other languages now. So it was kind of focused specifically around like Java initially, and then now I believe you can actually run other languages on top of it, was like in containers, which is pretty interesting. And I also didn't know that, and this is probably just my ignorance because I haven't worked on this service directly with customers, but I didn't know it was actually a VMware plus Microsoft collaboration. So to me, it kind of gives very similar, I guess, approach to how we did the like Arrow, like Azure Red Hat OpenShift, where it's sort of this joint venture. And it is managed Kubernetes. So I will say it does play in that sort of AKS container apps space because you are getting a managed Kubernetes cluster, but similar to what at least from what I've drawn, like delineations, it seems similar to Arrow in that you kind of get some bells and whistles that come along with it that you would traditionally use with these sort of VMware or Tanzu type apps. So yeah, I just wanted to call that out, that it did get a bit of a rebrand and some new capabilities there.
Yeah, the original Spring Cloud had 2 AKS clusters under the covers. I don't know what the new one has. But yeah, and the Tanzu build service is pretty cool because it allows the customer, again, to speak to Mark's DevOps story, where you don't have to worry about the DevOps, right? You kind of you just point at your code, and then the DevOps, the Tanzu build service will build your code and deploy it to the cluster and make it all up and running in one shot, right? So it kind of reduces that need to have all of that in your pipeline.
Yeah, and just a fun nugget there, which is unrelated to build while y'all are kind of deciding on the next updates. That is stuff that we're working on in container apps as well. So we do have the AZ container app up command, which we recently released, but right now you still have to have a Docker file in your local directory where your code is sitting, or, if you're pointing somewhere else, right? But you still have to kind of manage that Docker file. And so that's something that we're working on, is like ways that we can make it easier to go from just your source code into container apps. So anybody that is passionate about that too would love to, feel free to connect with me offline as well.
Okay.
Evan, what do you have?
Yeah, I mean, I thought it was interesting to see. So we GA'd flexible server, right? Or, I forget what time, it's late fall last year, maybe, for MySQL. And, we've added, an 80 core variant and then a business critical tier service level, right? So sort of taking the core product and then, pushing up the capabilities, pushing up the SLAs and whatnot, so that you can run it for more and more critical apps, right? Which is going to help our enterprise customers.
Great. And I'll kind of cover a few AKS topics, since Kendall seems to have moved on to ACA these days. So here's here's
Hey,
my,
we still love AKS, but I'll give you those updates, Sujit. I think you've got them.
So she already mentioned
I did mention draft.
Yep.
In the dev.
I was going to give you credit for that. You mentioned draft and you mentioned KDA, so you covered 2 of the 5 updates that I was going to cover. The other 3 related to AKS are interesting. If you use Windows and AKS, Windows Server 2022 host support is available in AKS. So if you use those newer SKUs of Windows, that would be interesting. Also available is ARM64 agent node support in AKS now. And you can get a mix and match. You can mix and match all these different node pools now. And finally, one that we spent a lot of time. I think even Kendall may be aware. I remember when we were at a customer a while back, an insurance customer where we had to deal with the CIS standards for the containers, running in AKS. And now there is available for the Ubuntu worker nodes. So they do give you those CIS hardened container option. This way, customers know that their code is running on a node that has been validated to that extent. So those were some of the
I want to put
related.
a plug for that, because I as the audience knows, I sit in the sort of the world of broken. Some of the nastiest cases I've worked over the years is when someone's has hardened their OS or their nodes or their containers, and they don't always know what they've done, or they don't realize what they've done. So us, sort of having the ability to know what the hardening configuration is and it meets certain standards, and that goes a long way to just sort of narrowing down the problem space. So I, personally, I love the idea of that capability.
I also need Evan to change his Twitter profile to "I live in the land of the broken," because it just feels poetic.
I would have to go on Twitter to do that, so that's probably a high bar.
Okay, maybe just your status message in Teams, just so that somewhere this can be captured.
I may have to do that. I may have to do that today. Actually, I like that idea.
Well, and my whole job as an account manager is to try to prevent you having to deal with that.
Oh, I see. I thought y'all's job was to make sure we had the problem. Sorry.
I'm like, Evan's been busy, so Mark, what's going on?
Well, okay, so I'm a developer account manager, so that's a little different, right?
I'm teasing.
Yeah, no, exactly.
It's a good partnership. That's the way we look at it.
Right, but so one of the talk tracks that I have is that instead of all of this hardening stuff and all that, and forcing the infrastructure to do the security, that as people are doing distributed applications, the simplest way to fix that problem is make the API secure, make your service interfaces secure. And then to that end, I saw some Microsoft Identity. There was a session on that. And if you're working with customers who have legacy code, one of the challenges that they have is they've typically rolled their own identity provider. And how do they dovetail that into an Azure AD world? And we've actually got this functionality I saw introduced where you basically can intercept the call. It comes into Azure AD, and if it's tagged in a certain way, Azure AD will then route it over to custom code that will then interface with the legacy identity provider. So watching some of my clients wrestle with exactly that problem, I thought that was a really nice announcement we made there.
Yep.
So I am becoming an identity person, as hard as I tried not to be, and
it's
and
hard
I'm
to
still
avoid.
resisting
it's
the
such a
data
core
side,
thing,
right?
Yeah, it's such a core thing. Yeah.
Yeah, Mark, it's funny you said that, because one of my teammates that I work with, or just someone that I work with within Microsoft, he reached out to me the other day to talk about managed identity and how the different managed identities work, because everyone will eventually have to know these things. It's inevitable. So I feel like I would never have told you a year ago that I was, quote, a networking person. I've kind of become a networking person, not necessarily by choice, but just because it's so integral to everything. And it's going to be the first or second conversation that you have when you talk about any service. It's how does it work with IPs? How do we how do we do Azure Active Directory integration? It's just the first conversation.
Careful, Kendall. You go too far down that path, I'll recruit you for my team.
I will, just so I can say that I live in the land of the broken. It's worth it.
My whole reason for being is to keep things from breaking. Keep people out of the emergency room. That's the way I put it.
Yep.
So I failed if it gets to you.
It's a partnership, right? It takes both sides. The other thing another cool service I want to call, we actually, at some point we need to get some folks from this team on, but the Azure Communication Services, which this is what provides chat and voice over IP capabilities for people that are building those into their own apps. We've now got call metrics, we've got email capabilities coming in from that. We're just sort of adding more and more capabilities for the communications elements of these apps, because that you're going to talk to your customer at some point, right? And so having those capabilities and not having to worry about the infrastructure is key.
It would be great to have a session to see.
On to that too. if we wanted to do a future show, we should definitely do that. I have a couple people that I've even met this week in
Bring 'em-
Redmond that I think
bring
would be
bring
eager.
bring them
Yeah.
on, Kendall. Let's do it. I think it'd be a fun episode.
Because we've avoided SendMail for years.
Yeah.
Because the whitelisting, blacklisting problem, you know, if they blacklist, you know, our SendMail server, that could wipe out. So they must have solved that problem, and I'd be great to see, you know, on that session to see how they've technically solved that problem.
Yeah.
One of the, I know we're kind of getting to the end of some of our updates here, but I wanted to bring up one which caught my eye. It was about the Azure machine learning, specifically the responsible AI dashboard. You know, one of the problems with any sort of ML style project is you have to go through this process where you want to make sure your data is fair, the models are not, you know, biased in any way. And they've created now this dashboard where you can go in and kind of do some of that analysis, at least help you do some of that analysis to make sure that your models are good, you know, before you decide to publish them or make them available to the broader world. So,
and since we're talking about that kind of thing, then one other thing that has not, like Maui, it has nothing to do with the Azure world specifically, but the GitHub Copilot. You know, the application of AI to helping developers be more productive, and the same functionality in Visual Studio, which I can't remember what it's called right now. Those look like, I'm a much bigger fan of that than I am the low code, no code stuff. I think that, you know, making existing developers a lot better and a lot more productive, I think is going to be a really powerful story going down the road.
Copilot is phenomenal. I've truly been blown away by it. That's one of those those products or like capabilities, I guess you could say, that just when you start using it, you truly are just like, wow, this is it. This is awesome. And I feel like having that kind of you know, like fan experience where you just like are rooting for something to be successful, because it made such a good first impression on me. I am curious, like, as part of this though, I did not catch this fully, so I'm about to basically ask a question and see if any of y'all caught it. So we have like a new, what is it, a dev box? Is that what it was called?
Right.
Did any
Yes.
Oh, for ARM. Yeah, for the ARM stuff.
No, not that. No.
Oh.
The thing that's like Azure Desktop, Azure Virtual Desktop, but pre-configured with dev tools.
Oh,
that's the dev box, right?
Okay. So Mark, will you
Yeah.
explain? You feel pretty confident talking about, because I'm curious, and I was during the keynote that I heard it, but I wasn't fully like locked in.
Yeah, so the way Satya presented that differentiated is that code spaces works really well for like web development, and I'm not familiar enough with code spaces to really speak authoritatively on that. He said, but there are a lot of other workloads, particularly in the enterprise, where you just need a full-on dev box, as we called it, you know. And then the story is that a lot of developers at the beginning of a project, the first thing they have to do is configure their dev box. So we're trying to take care of that for them. The key to me will be, you know, what's the price point? Is that going to be something that that people are willing to pay for? I mean, it's pretty appealing to me, but again, we've got to look at the price point. But that's the idea for where you still need the traditional development tool flow, and then we'll just pre-configure it and manage it for you.
Yeah.
In fact, it looked to me, if you think about it, the way the build agents work in GitHub and Azure DevOps, you know, where all the stacks are piled on there, all the build tools, it's kind of like that, but extended to the front end.
So do we feel like this would be for a customer where, like, we're not talking about just setting up like a VS Code environment in like a, you know, a GitHub code space? Like, it would be more like, I need a full blown virtual machine with like processing power, and is that sort of differentiator there?
Exactly. Where you want Visual Studio, I think, was probably the sweet spot of that tool chain. Whereas I think your VS, yes.
No, and you need like a Windows, like a more like a GUI style designer and all, which you don't get through, for example, through code spaces, or even if you have a dev container. Dev containers is the other kind of option available to you. But those kind of move for, as Mark said, for web style development. The moment you get out of that, let's say you want to build a Xamarin application, since you mentioned that earlier,
right.
That would be difficult through dev spaces,
Maui.
right?
Maui.
Oh, Maui. Maui. Damn it. I need to upgrade my code. Yeah.
Yeah. Cool.
Awesome. I think this has been a good roundup. Thank you all for the great updates and the perspectives on build. And thank you, Mark, for coming on and sharing your deep expertise and
Yeah, thanks,
thoughts
Mark.
as always.
My pleasure. Thanks for asking me.
We'll try and put that. I think Kendall referred to the book and news, so we'll maybe try and get a link to that and put it in the show notes. That should cover all the
It's up
updates
on-
that we had today.
I saw it was tweeted this morning. I'm holding that email.
Yeah,
It's up on Twitter.
And the other thing to remind our audience, right? We hit what 10% of what's out there. Like there's just so much more that came out as well. This is just sort of the highlights that caught our attention. So do go check out everything else that's been announced.
I will say we're not biased at all. So there's no product by any means that we talked about any kind of bias whatsoever.
Yeah, exactly. Cool. Thanks, folks.
All right.
All
Thank
right.
you.
Take care.